Hello, everybody. Welcome to our panel on exploring generational experiences, a discussion of the evolution of trans experiences over generations. This panel is co-sponsored by two of our employee resource groups here at Intuit, the Silver Network and the Next Gen Network. And I want to thank all of our partners from those networks who helped us put this together today. Today we're going to cover a wide range of topics from transgender history to how to show up as allies for trans folks to what our future could look like. Before we get started, since we're talking about generations, I just want to call out the lovely folks that I heard said that I was there on chat earlier today, that I'm the trans dad that some folks need. I accept that label. I want that label. It's wonderful. Eat your vegetables, drink water, pull up your pants. And call your mother once in a while, as long as your mother's good. Otherwise, call my stepmother. She'll be awesome to you. Also, since we're talking about generations and everybody's gonna make fun of me, just so you know what generation I'm in, this is my AARP card. I am not a boomer, kids. Gen X is old now. So I have this because I like discounts and because my wife got me in. So all joking aside, we really wanted to bring up some of those experiences that folks in different generations may deal with. And we all met earlier today. I'm Tanner Arnold. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a senior offering program manager at Intuit here with QuickBooks Payroll. Shout out Payroll Peeps. Shout out to Kai from Canada. I also do Canada Payroll. Go Canada. And I'm a founding member of Intuit's Trans Advisory Board. We are really, really delighted today to have a very special guest, all the way from Washington, D.C. Erin Reed, whose pronouns are she, her, is a queer legislative researcher, content creator, and activist. She maintains one of the largest healthcare resources for the trans community. It's called the Informed Consent Hormone Therapy Map. Her work has appeared in amazing places like the Washington Post, NPR, Reuters, and Vice. You can follow her on Twitter and TikTok at Erin in the Morn, and subscribe to her Erin in the Morning Substack, where she tracks LGBTQ+ legislation around the US. Erin, so wonderful to have you with us. Welcome. How are you?
Pretty good, thank you for having me.
Have you been able to watch some of our sessions today?
I have, they've been lovely. I've known some of the people that have spoken here today, and it's just really cool to see everybody in one place.
So great. Awesome, well thank you. Let's get started. So the first question that we're going to dive into is one of the areas we're interested in exploring is that generational aspect. What are some of those touchstone experiences that each generation of LGBTQ+ people have gone through?
Yeah, so LGBTQ history kind of crosses so many different generational boundaries, and there are constants that seem to maintain throughout the course of history. In terms of generational differences, and I'm here to speak a lot particularly about some of the trans people in history. We saw from the silent generation in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we saw Kristen Jorgensen, the first transgender woman to, come out, and all the newspapers. If you ever look at old newspapers for Kristen Jorgensen, she was military, she transitioned overseas, one of the first people to get surgery, and the old newspapers, they had it like, XGI becomes blonde bombshell beauty, and like they gender her properly, and there's no hint of any controversy over this. Like this was something that like people celebrated. And then, as things progressed, boomers, they ended up going through a lot of backlash against LGBTQ people. So we saw in the 50s and the 60s, the weaponization of things like drag laws that target people for what they wear, and that also target people for their sexual orientations. And that led to the touchstone moment of the baby boomer generation, which was Stonewall. And it's really interesting to see how Stonewall occurred, the events at Stonewall occurred in part because of this policing of how we allow people to express themselves and what they're wearing, and anti-drag laws. And they resisted, and that's how we got Pride. We got Pride because drag queens, trans people, and gay people all banded together and resisted that. And so then we progress, these generational things, they occur, and this message of resistance will continue to span these generations. So then we go into Gen X. And Gen X was coming up at a time where there was progress, and then there was trouble. So like we saw the AIDS epidemic and HIV, we saw the rising of groups like ACT UP that protested the way in which people were treated. And we also saw the formation of some of the largest LGBT orgs that currently operate today, like HRC, rose up in this time period. And the fights that they were fighting, we inherited as millennials. I am a millennial, and I grew up during a time where, the first exposure that I had to LGBTQ people in the news was Matthew Shepard, and like it was a terrible event. And growing up, we saw this violence that was committed against a member of our community, and we knew that this was something that was still going on. And then we saw people starting to come out and being openly gay and being unafraid in professional life, in their daily life. And then we saw the backlash to that. We saw, for instance, the gay marriage fight of the early 2000s. And it was such a big, almost just dark period in the fight, because it felt like things were progressing in a bad way. That 2002 to 2005, there were 32 gay marriage bans in state constitutions all over the United States. And it felt hopeless for a little while, but all the same, millennials, we've picked up that torch, and we continue to fight along with all the people that came before us. And we got Obergefell, and that is something that Gen Z got to witness. They got to witness the legalization of gay marriage. They got to see the changing of how transgender people are able to be themselves. They got to see the changing of the standards of care, where prior, like all this history that I just talked about, in order to express yourself as a transgender person, you had to cut yourself off from your family, live far away, cut off all your friends, reject all your diplomas, lose all of your work experience. That would be very difficult for us today. And they got to grow up in a time where that wasn't necessary. And that's, I think, the legacy that we're trying to protect for them.
Amazing. What do you see Gen Alpha now coming up, seeing maybe what's happening now?
Yeah, so, Gen Alpha coming up, they are also inheriting this legacy that I just spoke about. Gen Z is and has entered the professional workforce. Gen Z is teaching the kids now. And it's so beautiful to see the level of respect and integrity and affirmation that they bring to their work. And they allow these kids to be themselves. And these kids, they don't have to feel ashamed anymore. And I think that, people that came from earlier generations, we didn't get to grow up with that. And it's beautiful to see. And I think that's sort of what we're trying to protect.
It really is. It's so great. And that really paints a broad picture well for folks who may not be familiar with how far back our history goes. As we kind of click down on those experiences, can you expand on some of the key points along the way where visibility really started to gain momentum?
Absolutely. And before I go into like the modern trans history around visibility, I want to make it clear, because I know a lot of you have probably heard this before, that, oh, this is all like some sort of a modern trend, and that trans people just suddenly blew up onto the scene. But like, we have always been here. Exactly. Hi. But we have always been here. The first named author in human history, Enheduanna, she served in the priesthood of Nana, and it was a priesthood that was described as a group of people that expressed gender identity in a variety of ways and transitioned. And then, we had a leader of Rome named Elagabalus, who this history is just, a lot of times it's so erased, but like there was essentially an empress of Rome, a trans empress of Rome. Her name was Elagabalus, and if you read about her, she sought out gender-affirming care 2,000 years ago. Unfortunately, it was not possible to obtain. But then, you fast forward and you see, even in like the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you had, for instance, a black trans kid, Lucy Anderson, who came out in 1896, and she was able to live her life as who she was. There was this one time, I love this story, where she was discovered to be a trans woman, and she was arrested, but she was such a good cook that the bankers in the town were having a meeting, and they demanded that they let her out so that way she could have this wonderful feast. And like, yeah, they got her out because like she was such a keystone for her community. And so, we see all of this. There's so many more examples of people that just throughout history have emerged and been visible. And there's this idea that like that trans people are this new thing. And mind you, like we have had big moments in recent history that have allowed us to be visible. I mentioned earlier how the old standard of care was you had to essentially do something called real life experience. So before you could even start hormone therapy, you had to go out and dress as your gender in a very stereotypical manner, by the way, because they would entirely cut you off if you didn't. And that was the only way. You had to do that for 2 years before they gave you any sort of care. You had to cut off your family. And that changed in 2011. And that's the reason why people have felt more free to express who they are and to live out their gender identity. And like I want to circle back around to like this idea that we've all heard, in the media that like trans people again are a trend. And this isn't the first time that this has happened. If you look in history, you'll see, for instance, in the early 1900s, there was an explosion of left-handedness. There was 2.5% of people were left-handed in 1910. It was something like 15% of people became left-handed by 1930, 1940. And it wasn't because there was suddenly this contagion of people that were getting left-handed and catching it from others. It was just that they started accommodating left-handed people. Tools were being made for left-handed people. Left-handed people were no longer punished in schools. And suddenly, what has always been here was able to be public. And that's what we're seeing today. We know that this has always existed because of those examples in history that I've spoken to you about. But we're seeing now that everybody can come forward, and that's what we're trying to protect.
It's amazing. You mentioned left-handedness. I remember a good friend of my mother's who, she would have been a boomer, so she was probably elementary school, high school in the 50s, 60s, was left-handed and was forced to write with her right hand. Even in the 50s and 60s was forced to be right-handed and was never able to get over that. Wrote with her right hand completely illegibly. Very, very difficult to read.
Exactly.
And she would tell those stories about how horrible that felt for her.
And I think that that's actually a really good example, because if you are left-handed and you've never had to, force yourself to write right-handed or something, like, how wrong it can feel. That isn't who you are, and to suppress that, it presents difficulties in your daily life. And I really think that like this is such a good map onto the trans experience that people can understand. And I mean, I think everybody has these factors about themselves. We all experience intersectionalities of our identities, and everybody has things that they've been told like that they can't express or that they can't show to the world, and it can be difficult to hold that in. And I'm glad that we are getting to the point that that is no longer necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. How do you think that the impact of these historical events affected the paths that people from each generation have taken over time?
Yeah, so, we've talked about the events in history like Pride and Stonewall and the AIDS crisis and Kristen Jorgensen and then the modern WPATH procedures. And I think that it's just so important to show how all of us have been working towards a common goal. And that common goal has been liberation of LGBTQ people and of our identities and the ability to exist all together. And each one of us, each generation that we've talked about and the way that we've reacted to that has done so by building a little bit more on what the last generation did. Like whenever Stonewall happened, they built on this idea that we do know that we can make a better world for LGBTQ people. And they stood up and like they made themselves available, but then they made themselves active. But that wasn't the end of it all. Like there was so much more progress to be done. And I think each generation has come forward and added their own bricks to that and built up their own edifice that will show that people will in the future be able to live their experiences. And I just think that every generation has tried to contribute to that, whether it be to stand up to being oppressed at Stonewall because of anti-drag laws, to how we react to things today, where we are now seeing a resurgence of anti-drag laws again. And we have all of history to show us exactly where this leads and where this comes from. And I think that, I don't think that we're going to stand for that.
Yeah, you mentioned the anti-drag laws now. I know during some of our conversations, you talked about the three article laws. Talk about three article laws, when that happened in generational speak, and why they kind of parallel the anti-drag laws that we're seeing today.
Absolutely. So if all of you are not aware what three articles laws were, back in the 50s and 60s, the way in which they essentially arrested you for presenting as a different gender was you had to be wearing three articles of clothing that match your gender identity. And if you were not wearing three articles and they would count, then they would arrest you. And so this was used to raid queer clubs often. It was used against trans people and gay people and drag queens and people that were just out in public. And this was also weaponized, and we talk a lot about how this affects the LGBTQ community, but this was also weaponized against gender nonconforming cis people. I mean, you can imagine how there were cis women that were arrested for wearing pants. And now we are seeing a resurgence of anti-drag laws and the idea that if you are not dressed as your assigned gender at birth and you are performing in public, then you could perhaps face fines, be arrested, et cetera, if you're in public. And that could stop us. We are here and we are not following three articles laws. And so I think that it's just really important to realize the history that this has, the ways in which it has been weaponized against the community, the ways in which fear campaigns have been waged against us for doing nothing but being here and being as we like to present ourselves to the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like everybody to take a look at what you have on and think about whether you have three
Start
articles
counting,
of clothing that
Like,
match the gender that you were assigned at birth.
yeah. Exactly. And so many of us, that could affect so many of us. You don't have to be LGBTQ. It is all about reinforcing this sort of mythology that the gender binary is incrossable and that we are destined by how we were born to present ourselves in some sort of way, and that is what will judge the entire course of our lives. And I think that that's what the trans people that have come up today have shown to all of you. It's that this is not something that is grounded in reality and in truth. The people that are on the stage, that have come up on the stage, challenge that in such a way that doesn't only affect LGBTQ people, but affects all of us, affects all people, cisgender people, gender nonconforming people. It gives us a future where we don't have to match on to all of these things that we're told that we have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Quick pause to just remind everybody we're going to have Q&A at the end, so get your questions in. I'll remind you again when we're done, but get those going. So shifting focus a little bit from the people who have experienced these things directly as trans folks, how do these paths and experiences affect the people in the orbit of trans people?
Of course. So, we've talked a lot about how trans people and LGBTQ people have done activism, have expressed our visibility, have shown the world who we are. In the meantime, cisgender, heterosexual society allies, people that don't necessarily have the lived experiences that we do, they have existed and formed all of their views on LGBTQ people throughout time based on things like media consumption and based on things that they've seen and heard about queer people. And I really want to challenge everybody listening here today to think about how your media diet has formed your opinions on a lot of things, especially on LGBTQ people. There's this really good documentary called Disclosure. And it goes into, this one totally changed blew my mind. It goes into the ways in which transgender people have been depicted in media for a long time. And if you think about it, if you go back and you look at it, any movie, any film, any TV show that was made before around 2015, if it's a comedy, it has a half and half chance that you're gonna run into just random casual transphobia. Trans person will be a punchline of a joke. And it's jarring because I didn't fully notice it until after my transition, and the point of the documentary Disclosure is that we all grew up with this. As a trans person, I grew up with this. It caused a lot of internalized hatred towards myself, and I think a lot of trans people can identify with that because every time you saw a trans person, they were either the punchline of a joke or the victim of a violent crime or the perpetrator of a violent crime. And that's it. Like, that is the entirety of trans representation going up to about 2015. And now it's a little different. Now, like, we finally have, I heard people talking earlier about, like, Elliot Page. We have people in the media who look like us, who are trans. You know, we have Michaela J. Rodriguez. We have Kim Petras winning awards. We have so many people doing amazing things out there. And I think that media diet that changes things changes the way that other people see us as well. And I think that it's just really important to, like, be informed of that and diversify your media sources.
Thank you so much. I think you bring up such a great point around the media and how we've been portrayed in the media. My wife and I are huge fans of a certain cop show that's been around for about 23-ish years. And I can remember watching the very early episodes of that particular show, and kind of having some trauma over it and saying this was handled poorly, and there's misgendering, and even on a dramatic show they're making jokes about a dead trans woman character, or exactly what you mentioned. But if you really watch, and so I wasn't actually a fan of that show when it first came out. I just started binging it, like in the Netflix era, right? And I started watching multiple seasons because I have no life at home, and realizing as you get into the last few years especially, but you can see this transformation, this evolution from a punchline to just being characters on a show who just exist and are treated with respect, and who are maybe used to tell a story, but not in a sadder or sinister kind of way. And I really love the thought that a TV show can evolve like human beings evolve, and it kind of matches and mirrors that.
So think about what that means for a young trans person who sees a positive representation of themselves on television, in a book, in a movie. I've got a really good example of this. Last year, Amy Schneider in Jeopardy went on a streak, dominated Jeopardy. She was amazing. And this occurred starting the week of trans visibility, and she was on TV for like 2.5 months, and I was constantly reporting every single success that she had, because that's what I do. I report on all the cool things that are going on in the trans community. And I remember as this progressed, getting so many messages from kids and teens who, what they would do is they would watch Jeopardy with their family. That was like a common thing that would happen. And they could use their family's reaction to Amy Schneider winning to say, oh my God, like my parents are actually cheering on a transgender person. I could tell them that I'm trans. And this was huge. Jeopardy's big, like a lot of people watch it. And it's a family thing that people watch. And that's just one small example of how representation in the media can paint our entire histories and lives and can make a huge impact on people.
Yeah, I love the game show. I too cheered on Amy Schneider. More recently, I was watching game shows with my dad, because this is what we do, and a certain show was on, and somebody was voted off because they happened to be the weakest link, if you wondered what show. And as the host of that show was bidding adieu to that particular contestant, used they, them pronouns for that person. And I wasn't even watching the show. My dad was watching. I happened to be visiting my dad, and my head whipped around because I heard it. And I said, Dad, did you hear? And he said, no, what? And I said, they use they, them pronouns. That means that game show asked every single contestant for their pronouns, which in turn created a conversation for probably 9 other people, or however many's on that show. Somebody will email me and let me know. To have the conversation to say, no, we're asking pronouns because this is why. And if you're not sure why, watch the rest of today. So just to have that, and my dad's a great, wonderful ally, but he doesn't necessarily hear the things that may catch my ear. And so even with allies, we can hear things and have these great conversations. And then I mean, email the show or say this was great, because they get ratings too, and I just think it's so amazing.
I just want to add one last thing to this, and it's something that I just thought of, but it's so important, I think, is that, whenever we talk about youth being able to be exposed to LGBTQ people in TV, in books, in movies, this is why it's so important. This is why. And I feel like that this representation is something that we need to protect.
Yeah, absolutely. So we covered a lot today so far. We're almost ready for Q&A. Some of it was pretty heavy, but we also have a lot to look forward to. What are you optimistic about now and for our future generations?
There is actually so much that I'm optimistic about. And for people that do follow me, they know that I am constantly covering things like legislation and negative ways in which our community is targeted. But they often ask me how I stay optimistic. And my answer to that is that I am constantly seeing how culture has progressed and how people are feeling more free to be themselves, how people have come out in larger numbers and have made their presence known. Despite all of this, they're not going away. And I want to highlight a very particular moment that in particular made me feel optimistic. I grew up in Louisiana, a very small town in the swamps, in a little tiny parish. And I remember I knew that I was trans from an early age. I was online. I was able to express my identity online, but not in person. And I remember how scary it was to be a transgender girl at the age of 10 in the late 1990s. And I had tried to express myself, got really fiercely bullied for it. It was impossible. And recently, fast forward 20-something years, I'm on Twitter, I'm reporting news, and somebody messages me, says, hey, I just wanted to let you know I'm a transgender girl from a town that was 30 minutes away from where I grew up. So also a little swamp town in Louisiana, modern, but little swamp town in Louisiana. And she said, I just wanted to let you know that I was just voted to the homecoming court, a transgender girl. I cried immediately upon hearing that, because I knew 20-something years ago, no, you get bullied, you get beat down. And knowing that that the kids of today, even where I'm from, not only accepted a transgender girl in their school, but celebrated them to the point that she was driven around the football field and cheered. That was huge. It made such a difference to me. And whenever I think about hope, I think about people like her, people like the people that have come up on the stage and let all of you know how they've been changing things and all the things that they're fighting for. That's one of the things that I've noticed watching people up here, is that everybody has this cause that they are pushing for and that they've seen success in. And I really want to say that I truly do believe that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, and it does so because we're the ones pulling it down. And the people in this room are the ones pulling it down. And the people that have been on the stage are the ones pulling it down because we care. And things are changing. 20 years ago, this would not have been possible. So I have a lot of hope because of that.
What an awesome story. That's so awesome. And you mentioned the kids of today. I have a son, he's 26 years old. When I came out to him, he grew up with two mothers. And when I came out to him as transgender, I didn't have to come out to him as gay, because that was kind of obvious for him when he had two moms. But when I came out to him as trans, we just went to dinner, and I wasn't sure what to expect, but I wanted to be both an advocate for myself, but you heard me mention earlier that we need to advocate and protect our children. And so to have that fear and anxiety going in, and almost that clash, just in case that he had questions or wasn't sure or reacted oddly. And he's I think he's considered a younger millennial, but he's right on the cusp of Gen Z. And yeah. And I told him, and he just said, cool, if you're happy, I'm happy. Let's order dessert. And when I think about voting somebody homecoming queen, or being fine with your parent being gender diverse, just existing in space as going through life as anybody else does, that's all that I think the next generation would ask for. Nothing special, just to exist and have the same cool things that happen as any other time in history, in those same kind of moments.
And you know, it's those small things, I think, that really make the difference. It's the day-to-day things. It's those interactions. It is the way in which we treat people on a daily basis. That is how change truly does happen over time.
Yeah, amazing. All right, so we're gonna switch it up, and I'm gonna have my friend with the disembodied arm and my questions.
Spooky.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to just ask you, let's see, why are we seeing such a resurgence in anti-trans legislation in recent years?
Yeah, you know, I think that to go back to something that we had spoken about earlier, trans people do challenge these mythologies. Trans people do challenge the idea that we are born under this certain predestined path that is based on gender. But the thing is that so much of society has been also built on these mythologies, that you know, you inherit this sort of superiority by virtue of being born as what gender you are, that all of the structures in society have been, you know, raised to praise like this patriarchal sort of system that we've lived under for such a long time. And I think that is a dying institution. The idea that you know, there is some sort of male superiority and that, you know, the gender binary is this impenetrable thing. I think that we are seeing its last gasps. And then I'm also going to say that, like, I think that some of the fear campaign that's been waged against us, you know, the calling of LGBTQ people as groomers, that we're dangerous around kids or something like that. I think that part of what we're seeing today is a response around that, is a concerted effort to use that. But if there's one thing that should be clear to like everybody here, you've seen people that have come up on the stage. I have a 7-year-old kid. We have many people that have friends or family members that are LGBTQ, kids, teens, adults that are parents. You know, what changes and what moves, I think, the needle on all of this is that more and more people know a trans person today than they did yesterday. Every single day that happens. This was how the gay marriage opinion and the fight really swung. If you ask the question, for instance, do you support gay marriage in 2003, you would only see 30% of people supported gay marriage. If you ask that question today, it's 73%. It is the largest swing in public opinion polling history, and it's studied for a lot of reasons because of this. And the reason why that happened isn't because like there's like this whole new group of people that accounts for like a tiny portion of the change. The reason why it happened is because gay people became, rather than this feared other, they became people that you knew. Your brother came out as gay, your child came out as gay, your friend came out as gay. And it's a lot harder to hate somebody that you know personally and that you've developed that relationship with personally. And I think that's why it's so important that like you get to know the trans people in your community, you get to uplift them in your community, because that is how we change things.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Let's see what we have here. Erin, you have done so much amazing work for our community. While the goalpost is always moving, what would a perfect world look like for you and your content?
Oh, wow. I'm just thinking about like the Eden of free gender expression and everybody being accepting, and parents are all accepting and they love you no matter what, and everybody can come out and be themselves and not be questioned for it and not be harmed for it and not be targeted for it. I think that the perfect world for trans people and for what I'm fighting for looks like a perfect world for a lot of other people too. I think that being able to self-actualize, being able for everybody to pursue their dreams, both internally and externally, and express themselves without fear of judgment or discrimination. And I think that this is where like intersectionality is so important, you know? Like I think that a lot of what we hope for in the trans community are things that so many other communities hope for as well. Immigrants, you know, everybody, like we're all looking for this world in which the way our histories and like the way that we express ourselves will not harm us through bigotry. And that's what the the eradication, we talk about eradication lately. The eradication of bigotry is the perfect world for me.
Couldn't agree with you more. Oh yeah, clap it out, clap it out. One thing really clicked with me with what you just said, and here at Intuit, we always say, we're really focused on innovation, right? And we want to be innovative. And I always say that I should be working myself out of a job and then moving on to the next cool thing. And it's almost like you said, we should be working Erin out of a job reporting on difficult things so she can move on to reporting on amazing, happy rainbows and butterflies.
The perfect world for me is me not having to make daily TikToks and Twitter posts about all the laws anymore. That is the perfect world for me.
So great. We've all heard the okay boomer, and millennials are entitled stereotypes when we talk about those generations in general. What do you think causes rifts between generations of trans plus individuals?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying that I truly do believe that right now the trans community is more unified than ever across generations. Whenever it comes to how people have experienced their transness and their LGBTQ identities, I think that we have had to grow up under different time periods. We've had to exist under different regimes of how we are treated as a community. And so I know many older trans people that were forced to give up all of their documents and were forced to give up all of their professional history and start over. And I think that younger trans people have not had to do that. And one thing that we are fighting for is so that they don't have to do that in the future. We don't want that world to come back. And I think that just bridging that gap and showing how we have come from different experiences and we have grown up and lived and expressed our identities under different experiences and sharing the ways in which we fought back against the things that forced us to have to do that is so important. And so, it's the same thing that you'll see with generational differences across anything. We all grew up in times where things were different. But I think that the important part is what I said earlier about how each generation adds their own brick to what we're building. And I think that if we realize the legacy that we've been handed and how we can improve it for the legacy that we give the next generation, I think it's really important.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll have time for one more. This came from our audience. It says, while I'm not ignorant to being trans, I am ignorant to local political advocacy. How does one proactively learn about sessions, and how can we show up?
Follow your LGBT orgs, follow your local groups. I get this question a lot. And I first want to start by saying that a lot of people, they look at national movements around LGBTQ legislation and what's going on nationally, and they can get overwhelmed because that's kind of scary. But even in the most, inclusive states and the most inclusive communities, there are still going to be people experiencing oppression within your community. I think, for instance, about places like Minneapolis, which is one of the most LGBTQ-friendly places legislatively, or places here in California. And yet, even with all of this protective legislation that protects your rights, Black trans women are getting murdered and in your local communities. So if you want to do work, that is what you do. You go to your local communities wherever you are. And if you are in a place where things are hard legislatively and where they're pushing really harmful laws towards the LGBTQ community, your local community will also be there. Those are the ones that go and testify. Those are the ones that make a difference. And if the laws pass and if these things happen and you have to live under this system where you are targeted again, like people have been targeted in the past, then we can draw back from all of the experience, like I mentioned before, of prior generations, because this is not the first time the community has been targeted. And the way that we have survived each and every time is by you reaching out to your local communities, because those are the ones that you will turn to if things get bad, and they're the ones that will be there for you. The queer community has been, the local queer community everywhere has been so strong. Our history goes to gay clubs and gay bars and local groups that have been there to make a difference. And so focusing on that, I think, is one of the most important things you can do.
That's awesome. Just a follow-up to that. Those are some pretty big things, right? Reaching out, to your local groups and really speaking out. What are some small things that folks can do that if maybe we were not ready to go, march on our whatever house in our areas?
Of course, and not everybody can be an activist and going out there and fighting, but what you can do every single day is respect the trans people in your community. You can respect the trans people that you know. You can befriend them. You can make an effort to get to know them as somebody more than just a trans person. You'll see somebody and that might be the first thing you think about them if they're openly trans, but so many of us have this rich world, this rich life of so many cool things that we can do. I was actually joking the other day, I was at a queer coffee shop here the other day, and I had met a few people that knew me, and I had mentioned that every single trans person that I know has just this really cool thing that has nothing to do with being trans. I saw a trans unicyclist going down the street on San Francisco earlier. Come on now, that's so cool. And I think though that so many of us have these extra these things, and get to know trans people as human beings, get to know the cool things that they know how to do. Speak up for them. If you hear people talking bad about trans people, stand up for the trans people, your friends, your community, your family members, and let them know that you love trans people. These are people that are part of your family, part of your friend groups. And if they're not, then make an effort to make them part of your friend groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to close it out, not with my thanks, because I think somebody from the audience said it better than I could even do it. They said, "Thank you for being you. I am sure you hear it often, but you matter, your work matters, and I am grateful for your existence." Not a question, but it needed to be said. Thank you so much, Erin. It's been a pleasure working with you on this, and I know I speak for our whole group when we say it was just so much fun. I learned so much, and thank you.
Thank you so
all
much.
of you.